All right, thanking God the Father, the Son, and the Spirit once again for, as we've said in a recent lesson, the way that they help us see beneath appearances. Let's call 2 Corinthians chapter 10 Yoda for the character that comes out of the Star Wars series. 4 reasons that, God willing, will be apparent if you don't already know by the time we get to the end of this chapter description. That begins in the first 6 chapters with a theme that I think first 6 verses with a theme that I think carries through the end of the chapter, and that is either the measurement or mismeasurement of appearances. In the first 6 verses, though, Paul is going to begin by saying he came to them in meekness, which is going to tempt them to mismeasure Paul because he is going to seem to be well aware of his reputation as he is going to describe himself as the one who is humble when face to face with them, but bold when he is away. Not necessarily describing himself that way because he's literally going to describe himself later on as being the exact same in front of them as he is when he's away from them. But now he seems to be parroting the reputation that he has earned, at least amongst some of the Corinthians, as he will then go on to say, they mismeasured his physical appearance because in coming to them in meekness, they didn't realize that he is not really there to win, as we would possibly call it today, some kind of boxing match or MMA match where he's trying to get them to tap out and admit that Paul is an apostle or he is exactly who he claims to be. No, he is there, as he is going to go on to say, to basically overcome arguments or spin on what God is really calling his people to do, and to basically punish any tendency or disobedience based upon that spin or any tendency whatsoever to go a different direction than the direction that God has called his people to. And based upon that, in verses 7 through 12, he is going to talk about the way that they have not only mismeasured Paul, but they have begun to mismeasure themselves according to the spin or the beliefs that they've begun to adopt that are different than the things that Paul had actually preached to them as the foundations of what it means to actually serve God. And so with that in, I think it's verses 8, 9, and 10, he is going to say, even though they have basically begun to say that he seems to be a whole lot in his writings, but face to face, he doesn't seem to be all that impressive. He's going to say, don't get it twisted. As we have mentioned in verse 11, what we say by letter when absent, we do when present. Understanding that they seem to have mismeasured his self-described meekness in verse 1 with what they seem to describe as weakness in verse 10. But not only have they apparently mismeasured Paul and the consistency that he will have, even if he showed up in meekness before, they have likewise mismeasured themselves in verse 12. He's basically going to say that their measurements are off because they're comparing themselves by one another. And whatever manhood might look like in Corinth, it does not define what manhood looks like to God. And that's who Paul is actually trying to impress, as in verses 13 through 18, he is going to talk about a more healthy way of measuring as opposed to simply redefining your own circle and comparing yourself by those within that circle. He is going to say that, first of all, in verse 13, he does not want to boast, even though sometimes he boasts. He doesn't want to boast beyond the area of influence that God has specifically assigned to him, once again, in verse 13. Verse 14, likewise, he does not want to get their place out of order, understanding that they were actually there at the point back in Acts when the church of Corinth was planted. We would call it today. So they were the ones who planted the church, but in their absence, the value of that foundation seems to have gotten lost, which bothers Paul only so much because he wants to make sure that likewise he doesn't make the same mistake. He doesn't want to get into the habit of defending his ministry so much that he begins to boast in the areas of accomplishment of others, because the ultimate point isn't to specify or nail down who gets credit for what, because God is going to give credit for each one. As we said back in chapter 5, each is going to have to appear before the judgment seat of Christ to receive the reward for what they have done. In the meantime, the guesswork can be damaging because Paul's priority is to expand God's influence in other areas beyond Corinth. And so even though he is setting the historical record straight, he's got his eyes pointed forward to places where God still could really have a whole lot of benefit in the lives of people beyond Corinth who have yet to hear of God. adequately. And so with that, he's saying that's the point, because he's going to conclude in the last verse of the chapter, let the one who boasts boast in the Lord, for it is not the one who commends himself who is approved, but the one whom the Lord commends. And for whatever reason, that reminded me of, at least the whole chapter really reminded me of that concept of Yoda, understanding that the through line in each of the three paragraphs, at least as I saw the through line between each of the three paragraphs that the ESV has this chapter broken up into, is mismeasurement. And if you go back to the introduction of the character Yoda in the Star Wars series, Luke Skywalker, the young hero, and he's told to look for Yoda before he's famously seen in the form that we see him in today. He doesn't know who he's looking for. So he meets this old, relatively small, kind of shriveled up character in the forest that seems to speak in riddles and odd grammar. And he's hoping this individual can help him find Yoda, only to Luke's disappointment to find out that he's talking to Yoda, the great warrior, this little itty bitty shriveled up dude. And so likewise, when Paul seems to have over time in the minds of some in Corinth become this little itty bitty, maybe not so much shriveled up, but not so impressive dude, he's reminding them that meekness is not to be confused with weakness. Something that really carries back to, at least in my mind, the presence of Moses, who described himself as not being all that gifted in speech, but the power that Moses carried was, as Paul recognizes here, the power of God, not so much the power of Moses. And so as the word says, when I am weak, then I am strong. It's chapters like this that not only remind me of characters in pop culture like Yoda, who doesn't have to be very big before he let Luke know, don't get the meekness confused with weakness. And then likewise, Moses, even though he didn't necessarily speak all that well, he spoke softly and carried a large, as we would say here, big stick, but in the way of a staff, that accomplished some miraculous things before the king or the Pharaoh of Egypt, who was not all that willing to listen to Moses before he saw the power that was actually behind Moses' mission. And so with that, and looking at the way that a portion of the church at Corinth had begun to not only mismeasure Paul's ability, but to mismeasure their own, similar to the way that Pharaoh had begun to mismeasure Moses' ability in comparison to his own. My prayer for you, as we often say, is my prayer for me. God, please deliver us from the temptation to mismeasure what you're doing in the lives of your servants based upon faulty perceptions of appearance. Understanding that by the time we get to chapter 12 of 2 Corinthians, Paul seems to have found a life hack, understanding that, as we have mentioned before, that even when he really is weak, meekness aside, he's still, to the degree he is doing the things that God has asked him to do, even when he is weak, he's still strong, because he's not working in his own power anyway. It's God who's adding a blessing to the things that Paul is doing, which is why we've also gotten in the habit of saying God's best to you as you go forward with him. Because he's not working in his power anyway. It's God who's adding a blessing to the things that Paul is doing. Because he's not working in his power anyway. It's God who's adding a blessing to the things that Paul is doing. Understanding that Paul seems to have found a life hack in his relationship with God, as by the time we get to verse 12, he is going to say that, I guess, to the degree he is actually doing the things that God has called him to do, even when he actually is weak, as we mentioned before, he actually is still strong. This chapter reminds me that whether we appear strong or meek or maybe even weak, the only real power or value in our presence comes from God. Understanding that no matter how much we may be commended by others. If we appear strong, get their condiment. This chapter reminded me of the Yodas, even in pop culture. It happens in real life. Sometimes you might be really well received at a certain point in life, but as things in life move on, sometimes people get bored with you, your presence, or whatever it is you've accomplished. And so that seems to be what Paul is fighting. It is basically them forgetting how the church was established and the direction it was originally headed in when things were going well enough. So he's going to say that he keeps that same energy, and it's going to be proven out by the way that later on he is going to show them in person. But